Welcome to Unlocking Your Truth, another podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips.
Welcome, listeners. You're tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and with Corey.
Hello, everybody.
And we're broadcasting from UFV, from CIVL on 101.7 FM on the unceded territory of the Stolo people. And we have a fantastic show on Unlocking Your Truth for you today, listeners. As you know, we focus very much on this show to do with anything to do with intuition, metaphysics, healing, and all of that good stuff. And today is no exception. We have a lady on the show. Her name is Lisa Paglia. And she is the author of a book called Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost, Stories of Hope for Families Facing Alzheimer's and Dementia. And she's actually got an amazing story because 8 of her loved ones have had dementia. And so she runs a support group at an assisted living facility for family members of people who live in memory care units, and a placement service that helps people find appropriate facilities for their loved ones. And she's coming on the show today to inspire you and give you hope that despite the fact that you might have a loved one who is suffering from an illness such as Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, that it's still possible to share a fulfilling relationship with them through understanding them and learning how to communicate with them as their disease develops and progresses. Welcome very much to our show, Lisa.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me on as a guest, and I'm excited to share some great information with the audience.
Yes, and very important information because as I understand it, Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia are a major concern for the World Health Organization, and it's something that is on a trend upwards, and that it's going to affects a lot of people currently, but it's predicted to be affecting more and more people in the future. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. Currently, there are approximately 5 million people in the U.S. That's just in the U.S.
Yeah.
that have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And unfortunately, there is not enough money currently going towards researching cures for the disease. So the Alzheimer's Society is projecting that in the next 50 years, probably 1 out of 2, as many as 1 out of 2 people will have the disease unless a cure.
Yeah. That's unbelievable, isn't it? And I know that the drug companies have been researching and performing clinical trials, but they've had not had a lot of success, and there's been a lot of failed clinical trials in this area. Are they losing interest and hope? Because you mentioned not enough money is going into research. I know that they have been researching, but they've had a lot of failures.
Yes. And, Bill and Melinda Gates have recently pledged an incredible amount of money to actually do more research. I think they have had some personal experiences with it. So I think we're all hopeful that we will progress in that direction and be able to to stop this epidemic of brain disease that we're currently seeing in society.
Are there any rays of hope at all that you know of in terms of the latest research that's emerging about Alzheimer's?
Just that they are, just looking for ways to prolong it or even cure it. So that's always gives us some hope. But as of right now, it continues to be a progressive, degenerative disease with no cure. And, the outcome is unfortunately inevitable that it's a terminal illness.
Yeah. So in the absence of an adequate treatment, it's really down to us, isn't it, to manage the disease and make the best possible situation that we can if we have a friend or a relative who has Alzheimer's or another form of dementia. And that's really what we want to focus on talking about today, because you've had such a lot of experience with that, and I'm sure that you can help our listeners who are encountering this for the first time to really give them some tips and guidance about how they can make this time. I mean, of course, it's a difficult time, but how they can help themselves and help their relative to go through this difficult time. So I know I mentioned in the intro, you've had 8 loved ones with this disease, and I'm sure that's probably what inspired you to write the book, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you came to write your book, fill in a bit more information.
Okay. Well, I have spent over 20 years counseling families on helping them understand the disease. And I've noticed in that period of time a very common theme is the lack of understanding and education about the disease. I've been aware for many, many, many years that there is limited information on the day-to-day challenges that we face when we have a loved one with a brain disease that causes dementia. So one day I was called over to the home of a family, and they really were desperately seeking for some help and guidance on what they could expect. The woman's father had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and her husband's mother, who lived out of state, had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So it was a double whammy for the family. They called me over. They got my name off of my website and called me and asked me to come over. So they had a lot of questions about both of the diseases, the Alzheimer's that the husband's mother had and the Parkinson's disease, and what to expect. And so I answered their questions, and this other woman's name also was Lisa, and she stopped me in about 2.5 hours, and she said, Lisa, I just wanted to tell you, you've been here for 2.5 hours, and you have given us more valuable information in the 2.5 hours that you've been here than we've been able to get anywhere else in the last 2 years since we originally were given these diagnoses. And then she says, you really need to write a book. People just are desperate for this information. And I knew that because I've been working with families for decades. And I think that was really my aha moment, that I really needed to put pen to paper and get the information out there. I've been thinking about it for a long time. It's just, disciplining myself to actually do it. But that experience really was the inspiration that I really needed to get this information out so people would have references and resources available to them to help them with this dilemma.
Now, you mentioned sort of help with the day-to-day challenges. What are the day-to-day challenges that somebody faces if they're living with a partner or a parent with dementia?
Well, that's a great question. So, my book really focuses on the psychosocial approach to the disease. It's easy to get medical information about Alzheimer's disease and other brain diseases off, the website. But the day-to-day challenges, meaning the common behaviors that are associated with dementia, very peculiar behaviors, helping family members and caregivers understand exactly what's happening to the brain of a person who is afflicted with a brain disease, and the behaviors that are associated. There are a lot of common behaviors. There are some very unique and obscure behaviors. But the point being is, and I explain this to my clients, brain disease is not mental illness. Your loved ones are not crazy. What you see on a day-to-day basis is the disease itself. And if people understand that it's the disease that's causing the behaviors, and learning to recognize the behaviors and how to respond to the behaviors, because in my experience, the responses are counterintuitive.
Right.
So I teach people how to properly respond to the behaviors and learn to identify that their loved one is actually trying to communicate something to them. These behaviors aren't out of nastiness or trying to be difficult. They are no longer able to articulate their needs, their wants, their wishes the way we do when we're not sick. So the behaviors really stem out of the necessity that this is the only way that they may know how to let somebody know that they have a need, a want, or a wish. So I help people understand what's happening to the brain, identify the common behaviors, and it's up to us to really kind of put our Sherlock Holmes hat on and figure out what it is they're trying to tell us.
Yes, and that was the thing when I looked at your website that was a complete revelation to me. Because I get what you're saying, that, we have a sort of a natural response that we would have if somebody is displaying a concept of reality that doesn't match our own. Then the tendency is to want to correct them and say, oh no, that's not right, you're not remembering it correctly, this is how it is. And what you said is join them in their reality. Exactly. Don't correct them. And that was such a big aha moment when I read that, because it makes absolute sense. But most of us wouldn't think that way.
Including me. I mean, I'm guilty of it myself. But you really have to retrain and recondition your approach, because your natural knee-jerk reaction is to correct the person. We do that with our children and our loved ones. And it's just the natural way to respond to false information and false reality. People with brain disease, it's a completely opposite approach. We need to do what we call join their reality. And the reason why is because people with brain disease, if they're telling you something that is incongruent with our reality, it's not with theirs. They 100% absolutely believe that what they're telling you is true and real. So to correct them, to argue with them, to tell them that it's not, to say, oh, don't you remember this, can create frustration, aggravation, combativeness, because nothing we say or do can change their mind from believing that whatever it is they're believing at that moment is the truth.
It's interesting, you know. We talk about in personal development and things like that, and even spirituality. You talk about your reality is what you make it, and people adhere to that and they understand that. But when they're looking at someone else, sometimes it's difficult to understand that their reality is exactly what their reality is. I worked with a lady one time who I met her at a church, and she came up to me and she was talking to me, and she was telling me on how people are invading her head and that there are people from outer space going through. And her daughter came up and said, "Oh, but forgive her. She doesn't know what she's talking about and stuff." I said, "Well, no, that's her reality. You don't understand. She is suffering from this, even though it's not necessarily real. It is real to her,
It's
and
real to her.
yeah. It's so difficult. I think that's where Dr. Covey comes in, Stephen Covey, in his book, when he talks about seek first to understand. In this situation, I guess second is to seek first to find the patience, right, to understand, because I think a lot of it has to do with fear on the people watching these relatives, friends, associates start to decline. They don't know what to do, feel helpless and hopeless.
You bring up a really good point, Corey, because the number one reason why family members don't visit their loved ones in assisted living or memory care that suffer from a form of dementia is because they don't know what to say. It's awkward. They're afraid. A lot of times their loved ones don't even recognize them. So my hope is to help them understand what's happening to the brain and learn a new way, a better way to communicate with them, because it is possible to do that as long as you have the tools to do so successfully.
Yes. My dad was institutionalized for 12 years, and he had 4 strokes back to back. So he was basically not there in essence. And in visiting us, like, we used to go every week, and my mother was there almost every day. It was just around the corner. And I was talking to one of the nurses there one day, and she says, "You guys are great." She says, "You're here and visit." Well, so doesn't everybody else's family visit? And she says, "Most of the people in here get maybe 1 or 2 visits a year."
Wow. It's really sad. And that's been my experience too, from what I've seen out there.
Yeah. I mean, you have to have some sort of it's hard. I mean, it was difficult. It was difficult in essence, but even though my dad was gone, like the man that I knew, there was still somebody there, whether whether he was childlike or anger or anything, that was still his existence. And it must be, it's almost impossible to imagine from behind their eyes and seeing the world. But like, it's like when people talk about people in comas, oh, they can still hear you, but yeah, it's true. I'm sure that there is a certain awareness about people even there. And it's just, I've in those 12 years, I saw so many people who were actually wonderful people, wonderful individuals, but their families had given up on them because they weren't exactly who they were prior to their installation into a facility. So to me, it's just an amazing statistic when you look at the number of people that don't, and I hate to use the word care, but don't care about the people anymore. I'm sure there's still love for them, but love, there's a certain amount of caring. When you use the word love, caring comes along with it. And even if it just sit there with somebody, just sit there and just sit there.
There are so many ways to have a really fulfilling relationship with somebody with dementia. And that's kind of my mission and goal, is to help people achieve that by teaching them and educating them. And it's just, it's just as simple as understanding and knowing a different way to communicate. And one of the things that I teach in my support group, and I also have explained it in the book, is I kind of use this analogy. If all of a sudden, for whatever reason, you lose your hearing, you wouldn't want people to totally stop communicating with you. You can't hear anymore. So it would be nice if people just learned another way to communicate, whether it be sign language or reading you reading our lips, or writing information down on a piece of paper or a chalkboard. We still have tools and the means to communicate with you, even though you can't hear any longer. It's the same with people with brain disease / dementia. We can communicate with them, but we can't communicate with them in the same way that we are used to communicating with them, because their capacity to understand us is different, and for us to understand them. But we can still communicate successfully in a different way. And I teach people how to communicate in a different way so we still have healthy relationships with people with brain disease.
Well, that's wonderful, and we do have to take a short break now. But after the break, let's delve a bit more deeply into how to learn a new way of communicating, and also maybe let's talk a little bit more about the emotions that can come up when you're faced with that disease process in somebody that you love. So listeners, you've been listening to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey, and today we have a guest, Lisa Paglia, who is, she's talking to us about her experiences helping support families who are dealing with a family member who has dementia. So you're tuning into us on 101.7 FM on CIVL, and you can live stream us from civl.ca, and you can also catch us on the podcast at drlesliephillips.com. Welcome back, listeners. You are tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and with Corey, and we're having a tremendously worthwhile discussion that I hope is reaching out and helping some of you who are having the experience of going through this journey with a family member who has dementia. Our guest today is Lisa Paglia, and she's written a book, Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost, Stories of Hope for Families Facing Alzheimer's and Dementia. And her background is that she's worked in this area, and she's also had many of her own family members and friends go through this situation. And before the break, we were talking about how sad that it is that many people who are in care facilities suffering from dementia don't receive visits from friends and family. And there were two things that we were going to explore as a result of that. And one of them is, I actually have a client at the moment whose mum is in a care home with dementia. And her experience of going to visit her mum is very upsetting, because her mum is at the stage where she doesn't even know who her daughter is. She doesn't recognize her. So my client is it's excruciatingly painful for her to visit her mum because of that, and because that relationship has changed forever. And so she herself is going through her own inner healing process as the relationship with her mum has shifted and now gotten to this point. So what can you say to help somebody like my client who is going through that very upsetting, painful experience?
This is a bitter pill to swallow for a lot of family members, especially when their parent or their grandparent, their loved one, no longer recognizes them. And they take it very, very personally. So what I do is I try to help them understand why this has happened, and also emphasize that even though the loved one may not relate that person as being their daughter or their son, knowing exactly who they are and what their real relationship is, people with dementia always know, they sense it, they always know that there is some connection with that person. They don't forget that there's a connection. So they may not be able to say your name or put two and two together of what that relationship is, but they are aware, as long as they're going through the stages of the disease, that there is a connection. So they know that you belong in their life somehow. So what I have found to be very helpful is to explain to my clients in the support group, in the book, the families that I have counseled over the years. I have found that it's very helpful for them to understand why this occurs. So may I take a couple minutes to elaborate?
Absolutely. Please do.
So the best way I have found to explain it is by using the analogy of a light, turning a light on and off.
Mm.
So if we enter our bedroom, let's say, and we want to turn the light on, we flip the switch on, and then when we turn the light off, we switch we flip that switch down, correct?
Yeah.
This is exactly what the progression is of dementia as the person is going through the stages. The very first thing that is affected with this disease is our short-term memory. So the long-term memory stays intact to the very end, but the short-term memory is going on and off throughout the entire progression of the disease.
Mm.
So if you can kind of think of it as when our loved one with dementia recalls things in the here and now, the present tense, their short-term memory is on for that moment. When they start talking about things that to us really are not making sense, and specifically that they're not able to identify you as the person you really are in their life, that short-term memory switch has been flipped off for the time being. So throughout the stages of the disease, the short-term memory switch is on sometimes and it's off sometimes. So learn to recognize, and you can recognize it based on what they're talking about at any given moment. As they progress through the disease, the short-term memory switch continues to go on and off, and as they go through the stages, it will start to be off more than it's on. That makes sense?
It does, yeah.
At some point, and it's different for everybody, that short-term memory switch goes off and it stays off for the rest of the disease.
Mm.
So, but because the long-term memory stays intact throughout the entire illness, the person will end up at some other time in their life, and that becomes their reality. And that time of their life is going to be different for everybody. So let me give you an example. My mother-in-law was one of the 8 family members that I had that suffered from dementia. And I am married to one of her sons. And sometimes when we visited her while she was going through this illness, she would recognize him as her son, Roy. Mm. And, you know, she was very lucid and very aware of him being her son. And she would talk about experiences with him being her son. And then just like the flip of a switch, she would start calling him Otto. Now, Otto was her brother. And the reason why she didn't recognize him as her son is because when that short-term memory switch got turned off, she actually thought that she was a younger version of herself because she was placing herself back in a time from her long-term memory. Now, because it just turned out that with her, when she would reflect back on a previous time frame in her life, she was kind of placing herself as an adolescent. Mm-hmm. And she constantly talked about these tennis tournaments that she and her brother Otto would play with their opponents. They would always play doubles. Well, she believed in her reality when that short-term memory switch was turned off, that she was this 12, 13, 14-year-old girl. She had not yet been married, and she hadn't had any children. So this man that she recognized couldn't possibly be her son. She didn't have any yet. So in her mind, she replaced her son with her brother because that's what made sense to her in her reality. So this switch goes on and off, on and off, on and off throughout the stages as the disease progresses, eventually shuts off completely, and that person then gets stuck in a previous period of their lives.
Mm. So, that's a very helpful analogy. Thank you. Oh, looks like Corey has a question. So do I, but you go first.
and I don't know if you can answer this or not. Being that we run the show that we run every week is about spiritual things. So I have to ask a spiritual question. How do you think? Have you noticed, or how do you think the disease affects the spiritual nature of the individual itself? Do they lose their beliefs? Do they lose their concept of their beliefs?
That's a great question, Corey. And the answer to that, and I also kind of want to kind of lay that myth to rest, because a lot of people believe that just because their loved one can't remember things anymore, and some people have described it as like, I've lost. It's almost like losing somebody twice. You lose the person that you knew the way you knew them, if it was your mother or your brother, and then eventually when they pass away, you lose them again. But keep in mind, and this is very important to realize, that even though their memory is fading away, and that eventually they will be kind of locked into a previous period of their life, they are, living, breathing, feeling, thinking human beings. They are aware of a lot more than we think they are. So that is something really important to realize, even though it doesn't seem so, because they have a difficult time communicating things to us and remembering things. But spiritually, they are completely there through the very end. Mm. Spiritually, emotionally, and that part is, does not change.
Mm. Thank you. Now, I wanted to also ask, aren't there some incidences in dementia where, rather than coming from a place where they believe that they're in a previous time frame, that they actually might have hallucinations that are of not even within the scope of a memory, but something they believe is happening that isn't?
Yes, that actually is a pretty common behavior that we see with brain disease. Not everybody displays them, but hallucinations, delusions, paranoia are three very common behaviors that we do see. So again, it is the disease, it's not the person. These people are not suffering from mental illness and they're not crazy. My grandmother, who also was one of my family members with dementia, and from the onset of her noticeable symptoms to her passing away was about a 20-year span. She actually was one of the people that displayed all three of those behaviors: hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia. My grandmother, while she was still living at home, before we realized that she had a brain disease, would tell me stories, and I was a teenager at the time, about birds that lived in her mattress and would come out at night and peck her face. She also would tell me stories about rats that ran along the walls at night. She was afraid to take a shower because she believed that men were waiting outside of her shower to kill her while she was in the shower. And she honestly, sincerely believed every one of these stories was true. And me being, a 15, 16-year-old teenager, I didn't know what to think of these stories. I adored my grandmother, and I didn't want to believe that she could be making these stories up. She was so convincing that they were true. And of course, years later, when I understood dementia more than I did back then, it all made sense. But I think I just instinctively or intuitively, because, I grew up, you respect your elders, you don't contradict them, you don't correct them. I just went along with the stories and would just say, "Really, Grandma? Really?" And it turns out that was actually the best way to handle it. As I learned years later, that you don't want to try to correct somebody because that was her reality. It certainly wasn't my reality, but it was her reality.
How can you differentiate between? I'll give you an example. My dad was, as I said, was institutionalized, and went to see him one day, and he wasn't that far gone, but he said that one of the orderlies was physically abusing him, hurting him, and like how do you? Is there a way to determine what part of that of their reality that they're talking about is real or not?
That is something that occurs on a daily basis, especially in memory care facilities or at home with caregivers, because people with dementia report things like that all the time, and it's really up to us to, again, put that Sherlock Holmes hat on and do our due diligence to determine whether or not those type of reportings and stories are in fact true or not true. But we have a duty to find out if they are. So if it's in an assisted living facility or memory care, we really need to bring that to the attention of the administrator of that facility, that you were told this and they need to investigate it, because sometimes it could be true, but probably not, that they're imagining it, they're hallucinating, they're believing that things are happening to them that are not. But we still have a duty to investigate it, because we need to make sure that they're safe and that these things are not happening to them. Another really good example of what you're talking about, Corey, is we get reports all the time from people with dementia that various people are stealing from them. Mm-hmm. Again, we need to kind of do our due diligence and check out, because financial elder abuse is rampant, and a lot of it is actually really happening. So if your loved one with dementia tells you that the caregiver is stealing money from them or taking their personal belongings, it could be true, but it might not necessarily be true. So it's up to the administrators of the facility to investigate and either prove that it is or prove that it's not. And the same if your loved one is living at home with caregivers and just, check their stories out to for, authentication.
It's a shame. It's a shame that it happens, but it does happen. I know my dad, in my dad's situation, my mother brought him his electric razor, and that went missing every 2 or 3 weeks, and then she finally had to stop buying them because they were just too expensive to buy. And she went to the administration. I went to the administration and asked them. They said they'd look into it, but that was the last we ever heard of it. But that was many years ago, and so I hope that in the long-term facilities that they're looking after them and being a little more, as you say, Sherlock Holmesy at the beginning when they do hire their staff.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll tell you another behavior that is actually very common, because I'm going to piggyback on what we're talking about here. A lot of things are taken. It's a behavior that is common with dementia, that the person afflicted with the dementia can habitually take things that don't belong to them. I have a gentleman who attends my support group regularly, whose wife does this constantly in the memory care facility where she is living. And he tells me all the time, I keep trying to tell her she can't keep doing that. She can't keep doing that. She's going to get kicked out of here. And I keep trying to help him understand that reasoning with her like that is ineffective, because she doesn't think she's doing anything wrong. A lot of times they're not even aware they're taking things, and then they'll hide them in their room. Let me just kind of give you an explanation of why we see this behavior, and it's different for everybody. It could be as simple as boredom, sheer boredom. They have nothing else to do, so they see things on their journey around the facility and they like it and they take it back to their room. It could be a lot more psychologically kind of driven. And I'll give you an example of things that I've seen. So I've worked in assisted living and memory care facilities where the resident actually was a Depression era person. And they grew up during the Depression, and things like apples and clothes and shoes were extremely difficult to come by. So again, taking into consideration that short-term memory switch being turned off, a lot of times they believe they're still living during that period where things are very difficult to come by. So they're walking around their facility and maybe they see some fruit, an apple, or a pair of shoes that was so difficult to obtain when they were growing up during this period of their life. So they take them and put them in their rooms and actually hoard and hold on to these things, thinking that it's going to be so hard to find another one that they're going to cherish this one. So again, we have to kind of determine what's driving these behaviors, and it's different for everybody.
Thank you so much. There can be so many different explanations, can't there? So listeners, you're listening to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and with Corey. And we're going to go to a break now, but after the break, we're going to continue our discussion with Lisa Paglia about living with loved ones and coping in the situation that your loved ones have dementia. Welcome back, listeners, to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey, and our guest today, Lisa Paglia, who's been educating us tremendously about how to cope with loved ones who are going through the process of dementia. Now, I've got one curious question to follow on what we were talking about before, and then I wanted to go on a different tack, which is to look at, some of these dementias can be inherited. So I wanted to ask you about what people can do when they're worried about developing it themselves. But before that, I was just curious. You gave a really great explanation of how to help people understand what's happening in the brain. Is when people get hallucinations, is it what is happening in the brain to precipitate the hallucinations? Is that a different mechanism than the short-term memory?
Well, unbeknownst to a lot of people, there are actually over 70 different brain diseases that cause dementia. And probably one of the most often asked question I get is, what really is the difference between brain disease and dementia? So let me help you understand that. Dementia is actually a broad term used to describe the symptoms that we see with one of the brain diseases that causes dementia. And then again, there are over 70 brain diseases that cause dementia. So symptoms, so let's say the flu, we can all relate to getting the flu, is the disease. We get the flu. But when we get the flu, we all display different symptoms of that disease. Some of us get a fever, some of us get chills, some of us get body aches. So that's kind of a really good way to relate the symptoms that we call dementia to brain disease. Brain disease can cause dementia, but the symptoms vary with each individual. So Alzheimer's is the number one most popular, or the
highest incidence.
Highest incidence of brain disease. I honestly don't know anybody, and I've never heard of anybody that gets Alzheimer's disease without the dementia. They seem to just go hand in hand. Now, Parkinson's disease is a good example of a brain disease that you can get with dementia or without dementia.
Right.
My brother-in-law, one of the family members, he had a very rare brain disease called Huntington's disease. He had it, but he didn't have the dementia with it.
Right.
So again, dementia really is a broad term used to describe symptoms that occur with one of the brain diseases.
Great. Thank you for that explanation.
It seems to help a lot of people kind of understand the difference. But to answer your question, different parts of the brain are being affected and impacted and destroyed and damaged based on what's causing the dementia. So there is Alzheimer's, and usually the first part of the brain that's affected with Alzheimer's is short-term memory. Now, let me just compare that with frontotemporal lobe dementia. That is initially affecting the frontotemporal lobe area, the front part of the brain, which affects reasoning and judgment. And you see less memory impairment with people with frontotemporal lobe dementia than with Alzheimer's disease. That's the type of brain disease that we typically see the outbursts, the anger, the swearing, because it's impacting that part of the brain that affects our personality, our judgment, and our reasoning. So does that help?
It does very, very much. Thank you. Now, so as you've outlined, dementia is complex, and there are many different underlying diseases that cause dementia, and I imagine, or I know, some of them can be genetically inherited and some of them are not. So what can you say to help somebody who has family members affected by the disease? And we could use Huntington's maybe as the example, because that is genetically inherited. Or even the forms of Alzheimer's that might be. What can you say to help them go through that concern? Like, is it going to happen to me? Because some of them can be genetically tested, and I wonder if some of them can't be. I don't know. Maybe you can fill us in.
Disease definitely can be genetically
tested.
So you can get a test, and it can be determined if there is a history of it in your family, if you have a 50% chance of also getting it. Alzheimer's disease does not seem to discriminate. It can affect anybody. It can run in families, but who it's going to actually impact is very difficult to determine. Eating healthy, exercising, enjoying a healthy lifestyle can lessen your risks, but I know people who have done all of the above and still had it. There is early onset Alzheimer's disease, which is more rare, but that tends to be passed down to families. And the more generations that get affected by it seems to impact people younger, with each
generation.
generation.
Yeah,
So any of us, really, the reality of the truth is, any of us can get a brain disease.
With an incidence rate that high, of course, that's true, isn't it? So what do we do if we're somebody who has been diagnosed with an early stage of one of these diseases? Is there anything that people can do to take the development of the disease process into their own hands and at least slow it down?
Well, one of the things that's very interesting to know is most people are not diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or other diseases that cause dementia until they're in their mid stages, because the signs and the behaviors and the symptoms of brain disease are so subtle in the beginning that a lot of times they go unnoticed until they become so blatantly obvious that you go, oh my goodness, there's something wrong with my mom, or there's something wrong with my dad. And then when the diagnosis is made, you look back and realize there were subtle signs of it. It's just not one particular thing really caught your attention until it became very obvious. But that person could have been living with the early stages for years before it became obvious enough to take them to the doctor. So, just be aware and be cognizant of little subtleties that kind of catch your attention, that you might not really put a lot of substance to, but those little things add up to the bigger signs of a problem of cognitive impairment. So might start documenting these behaviors to the doctor and just saying, she's doing these things or he's doing these things that are peculiar, but I'm not sure that it really means there's something going on. But there's really nothing we can do to prevent it or to stop it. There are medications out there that can prolong the progression of the disease, but ultimately it's not going to stop the disease altogether.
And I should think that's quite difficult. As you're explaining, it's sort of like, well, the brain is sort of switching one way or the other, and so they might do something and then it switches back for a really long time. So
one of the things that Corey mentioned about his father, it sounds like he was suffering from what we call vascular dementia.
Yes.
And that is caused from strokes and or transischemic attacks, which are also another name for mini strokes.
Strokes, yeah.
So that's a different type of dementia altogether. It's caused by damage done by strokes. Those actually can be seen on CT scans.
Yes.
And so if you notice signs of memory, cognitive impairment, changes in behavior, one of the things that the doctors can check to see if that person has had any mini strokes or full-blown strokes that have actually caused that, and then you can kind of prepare for that person having cognitive challenges as a result of those strokes. Because not everybody who has strokes has the memory, the cognitive impairment.
Right. Well, and unfortunately, we've reached the end of the show. I mean, we would love to talk longer about this. I think that your mission is obviously really needed, and I'm sure you're doing a lot of good out there in the world and spreading this message and through your book. If any of our listeners need to get in contact with you or want to buy your book or look into the resources on your website, where should they go?
The book is available in both the hard copy version, it's a paperback, and also an electronic version on Amazon.com. And I do have a website, but probably the better resource to go to would be my blog, which is a Facebook page. And the name of the blog is the same as the title of the book. It's called Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost. It's on Facebook, and I post a lot of educational and helpful tips on the blog to basically do the same that we're doing here, is educate people and help people understand the disease. I talk a lot about behaviors and how to respond to behaviors, and just, everyday little tidbits that can help people kind of have an easier time with this journey.
Thank you so much for being on our show, Lisa. Thank you, and thank you for the work that you're doing. Listeners, you've been listening to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and with Corey, and with Lisa Paglia today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. And you're listening on CIVL, and of course, we will be back next week, Tuesday, 7 o'clock Pacific time.
Definitely. Bye-bye all.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to another Unlocking Your Truth podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips. For more information, go to our website at drlesleyphillips.com. That's drlesleyphillips.com, where you can ask questions or send her an email, and there's many free gifts on there for you as well. You can also find the questions that were asked during this show at the website on our free card reading podcast page, where you'll find a full list of them. Come back again.